Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Strategies for Remote Working with Microsoft Teams. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. You are welcome to submit questions at any time using the chat window on your screen. We'll address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. If we don't manage to answer all of your questions, someone will follow up with you shortly via email. We'll also make a recording of this webcast available to you within a couple of days. It is my pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, David Lavender, Harmony Chief Product Officer. David has served as an executive in enterprise software, mobile, security, and networking companies. David is an international scholar for the Society for the History of Technology, a founding member of the Humanizing the Digital Workplace Consortium, and a longtime contributor to CMS Wire. Before we start, we'd like to ask you a question. What do you use Teams for? Meetings, video conferencing or calls, chat, native document sharing with SharePoint or OneDrive, connectors or integration with other apps, or we don't use Teams. You can select multiple answers.
Okay, welcome everybody. And looking at the answers to the poll, we've got pretty much everybody using Teams. Whoever is using Teams is using it for meetings and video conferencing and calls and chat. About 2/3 using it for document sharing, which is interesting, and a lot less integration with other apps or using the connectors. And I think that's pretty much in line with what we've seen in other settings as well. So what a fitting way to start a webinar about remote work when I assume most of us are working from remote. Maya and I are both remote, connected through the internet, and it just seems like a perfect topic to be talking about when we're all going through this. So looking at the numbers that we have, Teams is great for meetings, and it looks like everybody's using it for meetings and video conferencing and calls, because connecting is really important in times when you can't be there. Teams is really a godsend for the keeping in touch, even under normal circumstances, but now it's absolutely crucial because you can't be there in person. It's really tough to exchange information. So those of us, I know there's been a ton written about Zoom in the last couple of weeks, a lot less about Teams, but those of us in the corporate space and those of us using Microsoft tools understand the enterprise grade quality of Teams. And as we see, about almost 90% of people are using it for Teams for meetings. But there's a lot more to Teams than just meetings. So as you see in our poll, about 80% also using it for chat. But there's even more than that to it. So because when you work with people on contracts or manage accounts or projects, you need to exchange information beyond speech or even just conversation. You need to assign and coordinate tasks, schedule activities, share written communications, particularly documents. Now we know Teams has facilities for sharing documents. We see about 2/3 of the people on the call are actually using the Teams for sharing documents as well. But it's not as simple as setting up the meetings with people. You know, meetings are generally ephemeral activities. Once they're over, there's generally no record of them. But that's not necessarily true of other communications. A lot of business communications live on, and they need to be retrieved later. Things like contracts, proposals, statements of work, price lists, engineering documents, many other types of documents need to be retained and found for ongoing business and also for governance. So while Teams does allow you to save these documents, it's not always easy to find them later on, and it's not always easy for colleagues to find them either. You know, what channel did you put them in? Which team is it in? You know, if you're working methodically and you have a good system in place, then it works great. If you don't, Teams can, just like it's the underlying infrastructure which supports it, SharePoint, can just become a document graveyard. And how you use Teams or SharePoint really makes a difference between something which is very effective and something which is just a place where things are stored, but it's very hard to find afterwards. And we'll come back to that in a little bit to talk about how you find information easily. But one of the things that's I think that's gotten a lot less attention, but super interesting in terms of remote work is what do you do with people who are outside your company? So people like partners, customers, and suppliers. Almost everybody working in business has some work involving people outside the customer, outside the company. And there has to be a way to communicate with these folks. Now you can set up team meetings with external parties, and I'm sure many of you do. It's not as easy as simple as doing it for people within the company, but it can be done. And you can even add outside parties to your network and share documents and chat with them. But for scale, this is a little bit cumbersome about adding these people because who are not part of the a part of your organization per se. So before we move on and talk about ways to address this, let's take a quick poll to see what our today's webinar's participants are doing, how you're communicating with people outside your company, whether it's again, partners, customers, suppliers, other resellers, any sort of other type of external party. Yeah, so that's what I figured. So looking at the results, just about everybody's using email to communicate with people outside the company. So about a third are using team chat for guest accounts. I'm assuming that's for most people. That's some people, probably not everybody, unless you're a small company, and maybe some other app to talk to people outside the company. That's pretty much what I assumed the results were going to be. In fact, the numbers almost completely aligned with a poll that we did, a study we did back in October. This was actually a poll that we did of German-speaking businesses for a particular marketing activity. But we looked at how important email still remains in the world, even though now that there's Teams and there's other types of apps that allow you to communicate directly with people. How important is email? We found that email is still important to 94% of respondents, very close to the number that we saw here of 96% of people communicating with people outside the company. And in fact, the numbers here almost line up identically to what we saw in the poll. And it's not only that it's important to people, but according to the same survey, we see that believe it or not, the email use is still growing. You can see here from the graph. So while people continue to talk about Teams and Teams use certainly is growing, email is not going away. And because it somewhat competes with Teams for collaboration and communication modalities, whenever you're looking at using Teams, there has to be a strategy to take email into account. You can't just expect people to figure it out, particularly when people are working from home, and we'll come back to some of the points, the specific challenges that people have when working at home. But in particular, we see here, so there has to be a way of integrating email into this overall Teams communication. Now, one thing that people don't realize is that when you still need to use email, it's not only because technology, it's also because of governance. Organizations need to maintain records of their interactions with partners, suppliers, and customers. And the problem is that when you work with Teams, the information that you work, even if you add guests to it, it remains locked in one of the partner's tenants. So if you're the main party and you have guest accounts that you give out and you're working with guests partners, so the information works quite well. You can set up meetings, you can share documents. However, when you terminate the relationship with the partner, for whatever reason down the line, all the information stays either with you or with the partner in your tenants. The other party has no record of what transpired. And that's really a problem in most business cases. If you need it for governance purposes, most companies need to keep records of things and transactions that they had. So even if you wanted to use Teams for all your communications, you're still going to have to continue using email to communicate with outside parties. It's really the only way that both parties will maintain a copy of the communications record. Unless, of course, you want to send faxes back and forth. And while I'm kidding about sending faxes, I really hope that people aren't doing that. Even if you wanted to, when you're working remotely, that would be quite an option, a difficult option, because then how would you get your official copy of the document into your repository? But that's just a joking aside. I'm sure there's nobody using faxes when they're working remotely to try and get information between customers and partners. So what are the two challenges that we have? Now we see here that there's a clearly in general and also among today's webinar participants, there's a gulf between using email and using Teams. And while that works, you can certainly get information between parties and so on. It does create two particular challenges. One is that you have disconnected conversations. So you're talking about the same thing, but in two different products. And it's very difficult to see the big picture when information is split between them. So let's take an example. If you're working with you're an account manager and you're working on an account and you're transferring emails back and forth with a customer or your client, and you have a discussion, and then the client asks you a question, and you turn around to your team and want to ask them, you start a conversation in Teams. So now you've got part of the conversation in email, part of it in Teams, and the question is, how do you organize that in such a way where down the road you can have a single picture of everything and not have to go back and try and piece things together. So we already have these tools, email, you have Outlook, you have Teams. It doesn't make sense to go out and get something else that solves this problem, particularly when you're out on your own and working from home by yourself. Which really leads to the next question: is that people need to be self-sufficient. If you're sitting at home, first of all, getting a new solution or using something else is probably not even an option, because very difficult to roll things out and train people. That's not going to work. And in general, you can't really rely as much on IT support. It's not as easy as just getting out of your desk and going over to Karen and asking her in the next office how to get stuff done. There's no one to come over to your computer and fix stuff for you. So workflows have to be really simple so that you can focus on work and less on manipulating technology. So these are two really big, unique challenges for people working remotely. Let's see how we can bring them together to create a coherent and a cohesive work environment using the tools you already have. A lot of this just comes down to working correctly so that you can get the most out of what you already have. So working remote, helping people be more self-sufficient. The key here is really about making the right thing the easy thing. You don't have the opportunity to do training, setting up sessions. Even if you were able to have internal sessions, there are always going to be people who are struggling, people who don't want to do things differently, are having trouble, and the amount of time that gets spent trying to do this remotely is really not productive. So you really want to make things as easy as possible for even the lowest common denominator in terms of technical prowess that you have in the company, so that people can focus on work rather than on trying to manipulate the technology that they have. The other thing that you need to do to help people be more self-sufficient, and this is really to go back to the idea of tying email and Teams together, is to have a coherent and cohesive methodology for capturing, classifying, and searching for information. So when you're working at home, a lot of times you're stressed. There's a lot of information going back and forth between different people. If you just save copies of attachments, it starts to pile up. You get document chaos because you don't know what the latest version, who has the latest version. People are working on things simultaneously. It's a classic problem of people working remotely that has to be dealt with in a way that there's a very simple strategy so that everybody's on the same page. Everybody knows what the latest version of the document is. Everybody knows where to find or how to find the information. And that's what I'd like to talk about for the next few moments, is offer a way to do this and a way to make this easy, to take the Outlook and Teams as separate streams of information, bring them together, but also allow you to capture emails in Teams and be able to classify them accurately so that you have one repository, and then you can use Microsoft's good search capabilities to be able to find things without having to either ask somebody to send you information or to spend a lot of time digging through different apps trying to figure out where that information was stored. So again, just before I go into a short demo of showing how this is done, really there are two elements that need to be done. You have to make things simple, allow people to continue working from Outlook. We saw 96% of people are sending emails to outside parties. It means everybody's in email, which is probably where you're spending the bulk of your workday, or if you don't have maybe now two apps open, Outlook and Teams. So you don't have to toggle between two different apps. And secondly, one of the biggest things is at this sensitive stage, when people are challenged at being at home with all the other things going on, you don't want to have to try and change behavior. You don't want to tell people to do things differently than what they are normally used to doing, because again, people have to be self-sufficient. Telling them to do things differently is only going to cause problems, and particularly when they don't have a good support system nearby. I always say, even in the best of times, tech is easy. Getting people to change behavior is always the toughest part of getting any sort of product or getting any productivity out of technology. So now is definitely not the time when you're going to want to try and tell people to try and change what they're doing. Secondly, you have to make it easy to capture and classify information into Teams from Outlook. So that you have all the information, emails, documents, conversations, all in one single repository, all in one place where people can access it using all the access control that's already in place for Office 365. You have one place to go to find information, and also colleagues can get to it. Everyone's working on the same page and working on the latest copy of the document. So if you can classify information correctly and coherently, it becomes easy to find. And then, of course, the key to all this, the reason all this exists, is really to make finding stuff simple, because again, people being on their own and having to be self-sufficient don't really have where to go to get a lot of help and information for finding things. So asking people, did you see the latest copy of the document? Did you just, it just lots of time goes on in the meantime. Things get, it's just very unproductive and time wasting. Particularly now, if people are under deadline for contracts or proposals or things, is not the time to make it difficult to find important information. Of course, to say nothing of when we all go back to the office, all the work that we did remotely has to be transparent in the sense of we want to have a smooth transition and not have to try and find all the information how we worked remotely in one way and we go back to the office, we work another way, and then trying to reconcile all the different information between the two periods. We want to have a very simple methodology by which we capture classified information in the centralized location of Office 365, classified correctly, so that no matter where we are and no matter what platform we're on, we can find information quickly and focus on the work instead of the tools. And that's what I'd like to introduce, Harmony's Smart Assistant. And Smart Assistant is, as you can see in this slide, is it's a sidebar in Outlook. It actually resides in several locations. There's a sidebar in the desktop version of Outlook. There's also a Outlook web app, which can either plug into the desktop or plug into Office to Outlook web app, the Outlook web app application. There's an Office app, so this also can be a sidebar for Word, PowerPoint, or Excel. And then there's a number of mobile options as well, so that you can work with it, either the OWA app on the mobile device, which is the only way really to easily upload emails into SharePoint or Teams, or it works as a plug-in to, we also have our own Harmony app, which is much more full-featured in terms of being able to work offline, being able to manage tasks. There's a wide variety of capabilities for things like business continuity, working remotely, not so much in today's situation where most people are working either at home or at a desk, but in situations where people are out in the field and there's a whole nice set of tools that Harmony provides for that as well. Today I'm going to focus on the desktop product. I assume most people are at home or at some location where they're working from a desktop. And what we see here is you'll see my desktop in an Outlook, and on the right side of the screen, what you'll see here is the Harmony plugin. So what you see here is, let me go to the top. What you see here is a representation of your Teams and SharePoint hierarchy. So right now it's showing me my favorites. I can also look at any of the sites that I'm connected to. Some of these could be OneDrive, could be SharePoint. It also could be any of the teams that I'm connected to. It's really just a hierarchical representation. It also shows document sets if you're set up to work that way. And what we're doing here is you're actually logged in through the sidebar into your SharePoint or your Office 365 credentials. So anything that's done here is making calls in your name to SharePoint. So all the items about access control, security, everything is respected because basically this is a visual representation of what you would see through the browser, but in a much more convenient manner directly on your desktop. And we'll see how this comes into fruition, particularly when working with Teams. I'll show that right now. So I'm going to select this email, and it's an email that I got from Harmon Young. And what I want to do is we're working together on a project, and Harmon sent me a document, and I want to add that document to a conversation that we're having. So Harmon is part of our Glory Inc. account. So these are different companies that we work with, and say for example, I'm an account manager, and I am working with a number of different companies, and I trade emails with external partners from and about these different companies. So I want to take this email, and I want to make the email and the attachment part of the conversation that we're having in Teams. So I want to take that external conversation and bring it in internally. So what I can literally do is just drag the conversation across and put it over onto the Glory channel, add it to that Glory. And you see what we're doing is we're uploading the email and the document to Teams. And what I get here is I get a question. So one of the things that Harmony makes very simple is it will prompt for metadata. So these are not required fields, but if it was required, there'd be a red dot here, and it would not allow me to check the document in until I specified the metadata. Now we all know that metadata is really challenging to get people to use it and to put it in properly. Part of the problem is it's just too complicated. But when you offer people just a pop-up like this and to select from values, so I can say this is manufacturing. All I need to do is just click save. It makes it very simple. People will do the right thing if it's easy enough. And the key to making this successful is making the right thing the easy thing. So if you can get people to, dragging it into Teams, can't be any easier than that. Selecting from values that are already available or prompting people to supply a small number of data, also not very difficult. And by doing this, you're getting the information into the centralized location and classified so it can be found later. So I'm going to click save, and Harmony is uploading that, updating that. And what it allows me to do is to start a conversation. So I'm going to click on this button. And what it does is it takes that email and the document, and it also not only puts it in the channel. So in the channel, you know that those documents go into the SharePoint files location of the channel, but it also offers me the opportunity to add a message that will appear in a conversation to notify people that there's a new email and document that are uploaded. So let me say, I'm going to say, hi, everybody on Glory Inc. Check out this new email and document. And I do a post. And when I post that to what Harmony does, it allows me to continue in Teams. So now when I click on the Teams button button, what it'll do is it'll open the Teams app for me or the web, and you'll see that this actually appears directly here. So I got the email and the document appear directly in the conversation, and now we've bridged the Outlook external to conversation with the internal. This information is, of course, stored in the SharePoint location. At Harmony, we do offer the option, if people work with group mailboxes, to allow the email to be stored in a group mailbox and the document to be stored in the SharePoint location associated with the Teams channel, the files location. That is configurable. You can select doing that. So now the conversation continues directly in Teams. So that's great. You can see the files information. The documents are listed here. The configuration that I'm using presently is such that the emails are stored in the group mailbox, so we don't see them directly here. But there is another way to see them through Harmony. If you do select the more common option of putting documents within the emails in SharePoint, they would appear here just as other documents would be, and you'd be able to open and go right to them and click through to see them. So it makes it all really simple. We've also added the metadata to the documents stored in Teams, which is not something which is easy to do out of the box. And by doing that, we've connected the two conversations directly together, making it really simple. Now, another couple things I can show you about working with working remotely. One of the things that's always difficult to know is what's happening. So one of the things that Harmony provides is the ability. There's a People tab, which allows me to follow. When I select favorites in SharePoint, one of the options is to follow those favorite locations. And when I follow a favorite location, what I can do is I can see if anyone has made changes, uploaded documents, made changes to documents. So right now I'm following a different set of libraries, but these are, of course, all documents. They're all live documents that I can click through to. And when I click on a document, it'll take me directly to that location. In this case, it's in SharePoint, so I can find the document, and by right-clicking on it, I have all the abilities to do things like see the version history. I can view properties, edit the properties. One of the interesting things is we also allow you to apply retention labels. So in organizations where it's important to store things for records purposes, you can literally from the sidebar, not leaving Outlook, be able to apply retention labels as defined in your organization as well. So it's really quite robust. And the key is, remember, you're staying inside the Outlook window, and the bridge to the Teams window is a contextual one. When I click through to Teams, I don't open Teams and have to start navigating, looking what happened to the information. It opens that information directly in the channel where I posted that information, and I can continue working as is. So it's really super. It actually connects the Teams and Outlook interfaces contextually and allows people to continue working mostly in their Outlook window if they want to, but to work effectively in Teams by connecting those two together. Another thing that's important, I said, is if you want to be able to find information, is of course to be able to search. So one of the things that Harmony makes quite nice capabilities here is to be able to search. You can literally just click on the magnifying glass and search. The search here is also contextual, so I can find, it'll show me where I'm looking. So in this case, I'm looking in our Harmony Marketing Shared documents for the word project, and I can find all the information, all those documents that correspond to that search with all the information about that I have in terms of the data that I have about that. So it's really convenient. I can create views of the information, everything within the one window, to make it really simple. So you can see here the search site, what I'm looking for. One of the things that we're adding in our next release, so I'm going to switch back for a moment to the slides, because this I don't have, this is not yet available, but it will be coming in the next couple of months, is to enhance the search capabilities so you can even do really sophisticated searches for on emails directly in Teams from the Outlook sidebar. So let me show you what this looks like. So again, we're back into Outlook window, and what you see in the search window now is the ability to add metadata fields and search for the metadata directly from the Harmony window. So in this case, the example here we're showing is the author of an email, the size of an email, to, from, subject. This is configurable per organization. There will be things that come out of the box, but think about how wonderful this is to be able to search for emails that are stored in SharePoint by looking at the metadata, either the default metadata that comes with Outlook or some of the specific metadata that you've added. So let's look at an example here. If I select author and I type in a name of who wrote the email, you can see that I can see all the emails. These are all email messages that came directly from that person. So you know, if you set the scope, you can set the scope of, you know, perhaps a site or a collection, and then be able to search for all the emails that meet that criteria. There's no easier way to find this. Now remember, if you do this when all the emails are located in your inbox, they're locked away from all your colleagues. Putting them in a centralized location, treating emails as documents, gives you the ability to search for them if they're classified correctly. Harmony solves both those problems. Work from email, make it easy to capture the email into a centralized location, classify it using SharePoint metadata, and then the search becomes really, really simple to be able to find that information. So I'll just summarize where we are in terms of some of the key points we made about working remote. As we said at the beginning, working remotely is challenging, primarily because people are they're on their own and they have to be self-sufficient. They have to be not only be able to know how to use the technology, but also be able to find information without other people's help. So those two criteria really scream out that you need to provide people with some help and some tools. Because our folks are all using the Microsoft Productivity Suite tools, they're using Outlook, they're using Teams, they're using SharePoint, they're probably using other Microsoft tools. What you want to do is you want to make it easy for these people to do the right thing. So minimize behavioral changes, allow them to work in email, in Outlook, allow them to connect contextually to Teams, drag and drop, join conversations in place. And that's really the key to being self-sufficient. Once you set up a very simple metadata for what people should be how to classify information, finding that information when people are remote or afterwards when they eventually go back to the office will be very simple and very productive. And that's how you make the most, that's how you become most productive with the Microsoft tools that you already have, very simply without having to install new infrastructure or learn new things, making it very simple for folks to work. So with that, I'd like to say, everybody stay safe, and we're going to go now to Maya has some additional questions. I don't know if anybody, any questions that came in?
Yes, we have many questions that came in, but before I ask you the questions, we have one more poll question. Would you like to be contacted by a Harmony representative? Yes, I'm an existing customer. Yes, I'd like to trial Harmony. Yes, I have some questions, or no thanks. Okay, thanks. David, here's the first question for you. When working with document sets in SharePoint, is it possible to add metadata such as keywords for all existing documents in a document set in one go by using Harmony?
Yeah, so one of the nice things that Harmony allows you to do is to do bulk assignments. You could literally take an entire set of emails or entire set of documents or emails with attachments and drag them in and apply all the metadata in one go without having to do this step by step. That's not only an enormous time saver, but it's also reduces the errors associated with classification. You pick all the emails that are related to each other. You can be sure that they all receive the same metadata because they were done uniformly without having to do it each time. Perhaps people make human mistakes.
Thanks, David. Another question. The advance of Outlook is you have a preview of the mail content. You don't have this when classifying mails in SharePoint. Any possibilities via Harmony to resolve this?
Okay, I'm going to follow up with the person who asked that directly because I'm not quite sure what the question is. So I will take that offline and answer that take the conversation through email.
Okay, another question. Our company's issue is that our SharePoint site is managed, governed, and backed up. Teams can be deleted, removed, and there is no resilience, so we are finding we are having to use both. This is frustrating and cumbersome. Any advice?
Again, can you repeat the question?
Our company's issue is that our SharePoint site is managed, governed, and backed up. Teams can be deleted or removed, and there is no resilience, so we are finding we are having to use both. This is frustrating and cumbersome. Any advice?
Yeah, so a lot of what you're asking, comes down to governance of teams. So I think a lot of what you're asking has to do with what's the policy for setting things up. In general, there's a big problem associated with team channel sprawl, not knowing where to put information. We find in many organizations, not only do things deleted, but that there's you don't know where there's conflicting teams. There's more channels, more teams than there are people in the organization. So the only good advice I can give is in terms of governance is that there's some policies that are in place to keep things simple, that you set things up in such a way that you minimize the number of channels that are created, and that there are some sort of policies for maintaining. One of the things about a tool like this is that you have flexibility, but flexibility also allows sometimes chaos. And part of what we're about in terms of trying to help with that chaos is to help classify and keep things simple. In terms of governance of the team's channels, I think that there are some other tools out there that help you do that, but out of the box, I think it just comes down to good policy.
Thank you, David. We have time for one more question. When you dragged the email to Teams, did it disappear from your mailbox, or can you configure that?
Yes, you can configure that. You have a couple of options here. You can copy the email, or you can move the email. It's configurable, and there are organizations who like to have it both ways. In some organizations, you want to be able to move the email so that you don't keep a local copy. In some organizations, look at having people can keep whatever they have is their own local environment, and what they drag over to the other side is what's shared. Also know that in many cases, you don't really want to save all your emails. In a separate webinar, we've talked about this quite a bit, is that the number of emails that are really business emails is usually a small subset. A lot of the emails you have are things that you don't want to save. So splitting that and allowing you either to copy or to move it as configurable is we have organizations who work both ways.
David, thank you for a great presentation. Thank all of you for joining us today. You will receive an email with a link to view this webinar again within a couple of days. If we didn't answer a question you submitted during this webinar, someone will follow up with you shortly via email. And we look forward to meeting you again at our next webinar. Stay safe.